You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast, episode 580, Repression.
Welcome into another episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm Norman Lau.
And I'm John Champion. Each week on Mission Log, we reach into the recesses of our minds to extract the morals, meanings, and messages from an episode of Star Trek and see if we can take the whole thing hostage. I mean, see if it holds up. That's what I meant to say. I mean, we're here to see if the whole thing stands the test of time.
This week, Repression, the one where Tuvok and everyone else suddenly remembers that there are Maquis crew members on board, and boy, are they upset.
I'll be back with trivia in a moment, right after we throw Norman into the brig. I mean, Norman tells you how to contact us. That's what I meant to say. Here's Norman with the contact information.
We'd love to hear from you. Mission Log is a conversation about Star Trek. Find us on Facebook at Mission Log Pod and on Instagram and Threads at Roddenberry Podcasts. The conversation always continues in the Mission Log Discord with near-daily live events and 24/7 chat about the topics you love. Get your invitation to our private server by joining patreon.com/missionlog. While you're at it, one of the most important ways to help your favorite podcasts is to leave a 5-star rating and a review at Apple or your preferred podcast platform. And remember, your comments could be used on the show. And now, here's John Champion with this week's trivia.
All right, Repression is a story credited to Ken Biller, and Ken is a familiar name for Trek fans, and the most recent of his episodes that we discussed was his teleplay for The Haunting of Deck 12, alongside Brian Fuller. Ken was co-executive producer on Voyager at this point, having started as a writer and then moving up and then being let go and then rehired. Expect to see his name a lot in this final season. Incidentally, he also gets the story credit on our next episode, which was actually shot before this one because, again, production order for early Season 7 was quite different from the air date order. The teleplay is by Mark Haskell Smith, and this is Mark's only Trek credit. And he has a handful of other teleplays under his name, including a 3-episode run on The Magnificent Seven just before this gig on Voyager. But as a newcomer to Trek, it wasn't solely his words in the final script. Oh, no. Brannon Braga went uncredited for a rewrite of this episode. Now, it was directed by Vinrich Kolbe, final episode of Voyager for Rick, the series where he contributed the most of his long run on Star Trek, but he started way back on TNG in the second season, and we will see him yet one more time when we tackle Enterprise. Now, I do have a note about locations here. The Holodeck Theater looks like a set, but it is not. It is an actual screening room on the Paramount lot. It's called the Gower Theater, which used to be the Desilu Theater. But before that even, it was part of the old RKO lot and was the screening room where movies like King Kong and Citizen Kane had their very first screenings for studio executives. Now, it looks very different today. That 90s paint scheme is long gone, but it's still there on the second floor of the W.C. Fields building, and it seats about 120 people. And by the way, the real Palace Theater in Chicago, which was built as the New Palace Theater in 1926 and later renamed to the Cadillac Palace Theater, looks nothing like this. And it seats more than 2,000 people, so a little different scale there. And by the way, in that theater in the show, they're watching the trailer for a real movie, The Revenge of the Creature, from Universal Studios in 1955. It was shot in 3D, just like its predecessor, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, in 1954. Side note to that, there is no film called Attack of the Lobster Men, but if that was a nod to Roger Corman's 1957 Attack of the Crab Monsters, then I am all for it. Now let's meet our guest stars. We have a whole lot of new and returning guests, mostly filling out our ranks as former Maquis. In a nod to Voyager's own continuity, Derek McGrath plays Chell, the Bolian, just like he did back in Season 1 in Learning Curve. Likewise, Jad Major plays Bajoran Tabor, just as he did in Season 5's nothing human. New to the show is Carol Krennic as crewman Jor. She has a very short resume, with Voyager falling right in the middle of her 5 on-screen credits. Another Maquis crewman, Yosa, is played by Mark Raffe Truitt, and Mark has a handful of TV guest roles and features under his belt. He even made appearances in Babylon 5 in the beginning and James Cameron's Titanic. Sek is Tuvok's son, and he is played here by Ron Robinson. Ron's acting credits go back to the early 90s and continue pretty consistently ever since. He has some other genre credits in there, like Andromeda, Future Sport, and Supernatural. He even wrote, produced, and appeared in his short film, Edge of Incursion. Scott Allen Smith plays Maquis crewman Doyle, and he also started his career in the early 90s, and he has shown no sign of slowing down. Scott turns in well over 100 roles, everything from TV dramas to sitcoms to feature films. Genre credits, of course, dot his resume: Stargate, Supergirl, American Horror Story, The X-Files, and on top of all of that, Scott has maintained a pretty full schedule in live theater as well. Finally, Keith Sarabaika plays Tiro Anatus. And if you don't know the name, which is maybe hard to pronounce, and surely you have already caught him in one of his nearly 300 other performances. Everything from major films like The Dark Knight and Argo to his incredible voice work across multiple Batman incarnations, Transformers, and Star Wars video games and animated series. He had recurring roles on Angel, Supernatural, and many others. Most notably, in the 80s, he was on The Equalizer as Mickey. And we're not done with him yet. Oh, no. Keith will be back for one more Trek appearance in Enterprise.
Welcome to the Delta Quadrant. Are you feeling repressed? Come see the violence inherent in Tuvok's system.
Prologue. After carefully reviewing the hanging schematic blueprint of the USS Voyager, a lone and unknown Bajoran man turns around towards his computer. As he sits at his desk and begins chanting in a religious manner, he reviews the files on his screen. Displayed are the profiles of several familiar faces: B'Elanna, Chakotay, and Tuvok when they were Maquis and serving aboard Chakotay's ship, the Valjean. Act 1. Tom is keeping the romance alive with his newly betrothed as he treats B'Elanna to a special holodeck program, a viewing of the classic 3D monster movie, Revenge of the Creature. B'Elanna loves that Tom went to such lengths to recreate, perhaps in too much detail, a period-accurate movie-going experience, simulating a 3D environment just to watch a 2D film made 3D with filtered glasses. How's that for irony? As they settle into Tom's reconstruction of the old Palace Theater in Chicago, and as Tom is eager to prove to B'Elanna that the movies were more than just entertainment, if you know what he means, they're surprised to see a lone crewman in the front row. On closer inspection, B'Elanna realizes it's Ensign Tabor, completely comatose. Tabor's condition is under investigation on 2 fronts. The doctor suspects an assault, having found microfractures in his cranium. Meanwhile, Tuvok, B'Elanna, and Harry examine the holodeck for clues. B'Elanna, recalling their time in the Maquis, notes that Tabor had survived multiple battles unscathed, and now he lies helpless in sickbay. Tuvok next searches Tabor's quarters and is surprised to find crewman Jor, a close friend. She claims she was retrieving a book to read to Tabor and has a solid alibi. She was on duty in engineering. Later, in Janeway's ready room, Tuvok suggests that the attack was an inside job, though Chakotay is skeptical when Jor is named a suspect. Soon after, 2 more crewmen suffer similar fates. Crewman Yosa is found comatose in a Jeffries tube, discovered by Jor, who is later found unconscious in a darkened mess hall by Chakotay and Tuvok as part of Tuvok's ongoing investigation. Act 2. There are now 5 crewmen suffering from identical comatose states and traumas, but that's not the only thing they have in common. They're all former Maquis. Janeway remarks that it has been years since there was any tension between the 2 crews, but Chakotay bluntly suggests that someone on her crew may still harbor hostile feelings. He corrects himself. Our crew. Tuvok is no closer to identifying a suspect, let alone uncovering a solid lead. It's as if the assailant knows Voyager's security protocols and even Tuvok's thoughts, anticipating his every move. Chakotay gathers the remaining Maquis crew and apprises them of the situation. Some still distrust Tuvok, while others trust Chakotay and follow his advice. Arm yourself with phasers and travel in pairs. During their patrol, crewman Chell tells B'Elanna that he believes there's a conspiracy against the Maquis, possibly triggered by a secret order delivered to Janeway in the last Alpha Quadrant transmission. Later in the holodeck, Tom and Harry recreate a displaced photon image that crudely but effectively illustrates what happened to Tabor, specifically the physical characteristics of the attacker. As Tuvok continues his investigation, he takes a keen interest in one of Harry's letters, a message from an old friend who was killed in a Maquis attack years ago. Tuvok sees it as a possible motive. Harry is offended by the insinuation. Suddenly, Tuvok is summoned to sickbay. Ensign Tabor has emerged from his coma but is unable to recall anything that could aid the investigation. Soon after, Chakotay encounters Chell walking alone in a corridor. When asked about B'Elanna, Chell explains that she told him she could handle herself. The computer locates her in Cargo Bay 2. Chakotay finds her there, unconscious like the others, but this time, Tuvok is standing over her. He easily subdues Chakotay and completes his assault with a mind meld. Act 3. While Tuvok continues his investigation, the captain orders all non-essential personnel confined to quarters for safety. Janeway informs Tuvok that crewman Yosa and Jor, like Tabor, have both recovered from their comas, describing the experience as feeling no worse than a good night's sleep. Tuvok is beginning to show signs of stress. The lack of patterns or logic is undermining his ability to piece together the evidence and surveillance data. He feels there is a purpose to these attacks, but he just can't see it. Janeway suggests that her security chief needs rest, and that the investigation may benefit from fresh eyes and a new perspective. In his quarters, Tuvok begins his meditations, hoping to find the clarity needed for the next phase of his investigation. But he is suddenly struck by flashes, memories of attacking crew members, of fighting with Chakotay, who used a blunt object that left a visible bruise on Tuvok's ribs. Just as he tries to focus more clearly on the memory, his concentration is broken by the sight of an unknown Bajoran man in the mirror's reflection, who vanishes when Tuvok turns to confront him. Later, Tuvok returns to the scene of the first attack, Tom's holoprogram, where Tom and Harry are still working to reconstruct the attacker's physical profile. After reviewing certain details that have been mysteriously locked behind Tuvok's own security codes, he confirms that he was in the cargo bay when B'Elanna and Chakotay were attacked. Suddenly, Tuvok draws his phaser and points it at the same Bajoran apparition he saw earlier in his quarters. Realizing what's happening and admitting he is a danger to himself and the crew, Tuvok surrenders to Janeway and requests to be confined to the brig for everyone's safety. Act 4. Standing just outside the brig's force field, Janeway tries to help Tuvok make sense of what he's experiencing. She recites to him the words that Tuvok believes are some sort of incantation meant to control him. He suspects that both the man behind the incantation and the words themselves are Bajoran. Tuvok confesses that he was the one who attacked the Maquis crew members, Tabor, Yosa, Jor, Chakotay, and B'Elanna. The only unusual event preceding the attacks was his reading of a letter from Sek, his son. It was one of 28 letters, including the one from Harry's friend that arrived in the last Alpha Quadrant data stream. After 29 hours, Chakotay awakens and is cleared for duty. He joins the captain, 7 of 9, and B'Elanna in astrometrics. 7 has discovered a hidden frequency embedded in the message from Tuvok's son. When calibrated to match a Vulcan-specific synaptic frequency, the message reveals, behind Sek's image, the profile of a Bajoran man whom Chakotay immediately recognizes. Tiro Anatus, a fanatical Bajoran Vedic whose unethical mind control experiments were considered too extreme, even by Maquis standards. Janeway brings this information to Tuvok, triggering more specific memories of being kidnapped and tortured by Tiro, who eventually broke through Tuvok's nearly unbreakable Vulcan mental discipline. During his captivity, Tiro implanted a mental program deep within Tuvok's subconscious, but to what end? Tuvok does not know. As Janeway tries to help Tuvok break free of Tiro's influence, it becomes clear the programming runs too deep. Still trapped in his hallucinations, Tuvok activates his comm badge and transmits a message to Chakotay. Pog to M far Patane. Chakotay responds, understood. Tuvok regretfully admits he doesn't know what that means or what he has done. Chakotay then bursts into sickbay, deactivates the doctor, stuns Tom with a phaser blast, and finally activates B'Elanna, yet another sleeper Maquis. Act 5. With all the Maquis crew back under his command, and with the majority of the Starfleet crew already confined to quarters, Chakotay swiftly and effectively locks down Voyager, seizing control of the ship. His mutiny is complete when he captures Janeway and places her in the brig with Tuvok. Tuvok then leaves her side, having accepted that he was the cause of it all and joined Chakotay's side. Janeway tries to reason with Chakotay, reminding him that the Maquis rebellion ended years ago, but Chakotay declares that as long as the Maquis on Voyager are alive, so too is the rebellion. Later in Janeway's ready room, the newly minted, and now more appropriately dressed, Captain Chakotay, resembling his former Maquis self before joining Voyager, meets with Tuvok. He offers him a glass of Vulcan brandy so they can toast their successful takeover of the ship. There's one last thing, though. When Janeway is dragged in by Maquis guards, Chakotay hands Tuvok a phaser and orders him to kill her as a final act of loyalty. Janeway pleads with Tuvok not to do it. Tuvok fires and the phaser malfunctions. After Janeway is returned to the brig, Chakotay reveals it was all a test. Suddenly, Tuvok catches Chakotay off guard and initiates a mind meld. Freed from Tiro's programming, Chakotay and Tuvok rejoin B'Elanna and their Maquis comrades on the bridge. Using the element of surprise, they move swiftly and decisively to quell the uprising and restore order to the ship. After deprogramming the rest of the Maquis, many of the crew return to the holodeck theater for some much-needed escapism. Tuvok sits beside Janeway and quietly admits that he knew the phaser was harmless, that even Chakotay wouldn't risk her life to prove a point. Grateful that Tuvok trusted his instincts, Janeway leans back alongside her old friend, and they put on their 3D glasses as the house lights go down. The end.
All right, nicely done, Norman. First of all, we got to look at all the stuff in that room, and I'm wondering where the big poster of Voyager came from. There's a lot of things in that room that I would want, but you know, I guess they're not available for master replicas.
I mean, I love schematics. There was a LCAR schematic of Voyager in cross section. There was also, I do believe, seeing a concept design, like a sketch of Chakotay's Valjean in the background. And I do remember, I think that was featured in the collectible magazine from the Eagle Moss Maquis Raider.
Right when the camera kind of pans around that desk, I think we actually see a model of that Raider.
Yeah.
So I might be wrong, because it might have been a little too blurry, but I kept going through and trying to freeze frame and like, ooh, wait a minute, what is that? What is that? But I'm glad that you named, of course you named it. It's the Valjean. So kind of nice to have that canonized on screen.
On the screen, on the computer screen, there's kind of like several, I guess, portraits of crew members. We see B'Elanna, we see Chakotay, and then another crew member, and then all of a sudden Tuvok kind of like flips through. I like it that they almost like they're reference photos from Caretaker.
Yeah,
and
right.
I'm going to go on record saying this. I think they should have kept Robert Beltran's original hair color, the salt and pepper gray, because I thought he looked way better than the dye job that they gave Chakotay.
Yeah. Why not? Why not let him have a little age on him? You know, look.
Also,
cool.
Looking really deep at B'Elanna's crew ID number. From what I can see on screen, it was R8-911-4747-JVD. So there you go.
All right. So there's our 47. We needed to get that. It's funny, in my initial notes, I said, hey, that's a nice looking theater set. And that's before I realized that they actually shot in a screening room on the lot. Obviously not a movie palace, as Tom is sort of hyping it up to be, but it's a cool-looking vintage theater, and it is legit a vintage theater.
I like the attention to detail in the crowd, like the audience. So people were having, their evening out. It looked like in the 1950s, and you had the hairstyles were right, the clothing was right, the 3D punch-out glasses were right, the popcorn cartons and the soda cups were right. Here's the weird thing, though, that Tom and B'Elanna weren't dressed in period-accurate clothing, and he would be the first one to do that, right?
Yes, that would have been cool if they had put them in some vintage clothing. I think because everything else looked great. It looked like Back to the Future,
exactly.
You know, and
right.
Yeah, it was very cool. Like if I'm going to have a 1950s holodeck experience in a movie theater, then I want all of that, and I want it to be completely
B'Elanna
accurate,
in a pencil or a poodle skirt would have been phenomenal.
Yes, of course. Now, I love B'Elanna pointing out the meta of watching a 3D film in the holodeck, which is 3D, you know, so very cool. And they're watching, as I mentioned in the trivia, they're watching Return of the Creature, but they're watching the trailer for Return of the Creature. Trailer is pretty much always public domain, so that makes sense.
It was interesting seeing the movie screen from kind of like the audience's point of view, because we weren't wearing glasses, and you would see the non-filtered imagery on the screen where it was projected from two different projectors. So I thought that was really smart idea.
Well, and that looked cool when they turn the camera around. You have the green and red light coming from the projection house, from the booth. Yeah. So that was cool. I do have to wonder, does holographic gum stay stuck to your shoe when you leave the holodeck? Or is it just sticky while you're in there?
Interesting.
And then you step out and poof, it disappears, you know? I like that early on we have a return of Inspector Tuvok. We haven't seen him in a long time. And we do have this thing about Tuvok having a hunch, which is out of character. He's not wrong that most crimes are carried out by people who know their victims. But I'm going to come back to this idea about Tuvok having a hunch, because I think that is important here and may even lead into what little glimmer of a moral meaning or message we get to explore.
I like the scene with Tuvok and Chakotay comparing notes and obviously disagreeing on Tuvok's opinion on what's happening. Tuvok says, it's my experience that emotional involvements often lead to unpredictable behavior. Chakotay says that's an opinion, not evidence. It's almost as if Chakotay's taken that role because Tuvok in some ways already compromised early in this episode.
Yeah.
But I think that we need to see more of that. We needed to see more of that. I wouldn't say tension. I would say critical analysis of the situation as being Janeway's two top advisors. Yeah. Also being, Tuvok being her oldest friend, and Chakotay being someone she cares about, more than on a professional level, also advising her.
Just a minor suggestion for me. I believe I mentioned this, 9 or 10 dozen times during DS9. How about security cameras in public places? Maybe even just outside of Jeffrey's tubes. Stuff like that could save you a world of problems.
If only there was technology that can capture in 360 degrees.
If only, but they just don't. They don't have that.
Did you notice in the background when the doctor's saying, I should open up a coma ward because I need the beds? There were actual science uniform crewmen, behind the scenes taking care of the patients. So I'm wondering, when did the doctor train that staff? I mean,
he should have just had Tom in there going from bed to bed to bed. Yeah, should have been Tom running around. Yeah. I love first of all, there's a lot of people in sickbay, and we have a full mess hall, and I love it when we get to have a full mess hall with people we haven't seen before. It just makes Voyager feel full and lived in, and immediately the camera went by, and I went, ooh, a Bolian. No, wait, 2 Bolians. And on top of that, a Vulcan woman who we've never seen before. This was, why could we have not had more of that all along? It would have been great. And I do like that we've got a shout out to Naomi Wildman in a funny way that works into the script. That was very clever. And then kind of weird, I thought just the whole pretense of the holodeck being able to recreate what someone was doing in there or where they were positioned. First of all, it could be very awkward for any number of situations. But of course, the way they have to build the technology for the script to play out, it's like you can only see just enough. You can't quite get it. You got to wait for the computer to catch up with you. And that might take, it might take a few seconds, might take a few days. Who knows? It's just as long as it takes for the story to play
reminded me of kind of like the whole point of, there was a film, some type of like Polaroid film residue like left behind in the movie No Way Out. And they were trying to like develop like ruined negative to see who murdered somebody in that movie. Kevin Costner was the Yuri character. Sorry, spoiler, but that was like in the 80s.
Oh,
and that's what this reminded me of. Like there was a time frame, where sooner or later, the assailant, or we know who it was, would be identified.
Yeah.
There was, in that scene when they're talking about the Maquis crew not having an issue with the Starfleet crew anymore. B'Elanna says, "We put our differences aside 7 years ago. It's ancient history. See Seska, Suter, Jonas, all within that 7 years. So it's not really 7 years. I mean, that happened in seasons 3 and 2 and 3, of Voyager.
Right. Yeah. So at least, seems like some people forgot. But I also like that Chell Arbolian, he says, "Oh, we have a conspiracy." And I thought, see also conspiracy, the Voyager conspiracy, and maybe he should go talk to Seven about that. Harry Kim says to Tuvok, when Tuvok calls him in for questioning, "You read my mail? Isn't that a violation of privacy protocols?" And my note was, see also Neelix, who just does that because he does.
As long as you deliver mail
Harry,
with a smile.
I guess so. I guess all it takes, And in that scene, I thought it was a good scene with Tuvok and Harry, but I felt like, all right, Tuvok isn't 100% out of line here. He might be close to getting completely out of line, but he's not totally out of line. He's trying to make sure he questions everybody, take everything seriously. Harry really has a strong reaction. And I'm just thinking he should have probably played it cool to not raise suspicion,
Yeah, I think it's traditional, the way that Harry and Tuvok have had dust-ups before, where Tuvok always kind of looked down at the young ensign, and he didn't behave in a way that was bridge protocol, standard. Harry was always a little bit more emotional, and I think that Tuvok just knows how to push his buttons. That's all.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah.
Oh, that fight in Cargo Bay 2. I mean, Chakotay took that punch like a champ, but when you're a boxer, you're used to...
Famously, he is a boxer,
You know how to take a punch, right?
Yeah.
But here's the cool thing. I love really good choreography, fight choreography. And when Chakotay swings at him, or I should say Robert swings at him, Tim ducks, chicken wings the punch into an arm bar, and then wraps the mind meld around, Robert's face.
Yeah.
That was really smooth. Really,
it was
well
intense.
done.
Yeah, that was really good. And by the way, so I was, not that I was tuning out, but the first couple of acts, I was feeling like, oh, okay, we're just going to do this thing where we maybe create a suspect and then confuse the audience a little, go find another suspect. But right at the end of Act 2, oh, no, it's Tuvok. And I thought, oh, okay, now this is getting interesting because this early in the show, we've completely flipped the expectation around. So I was genuinely surprised first time I watched it. Now, I like the way the script takes a turn here, because when we come into Act 3, the audience now knows more of what's going on than the rest of the crew. So up until now, the teaser, Act 1, Act 2, we only know as much as every other character in that show. But by the time you get to the reveal with Tuvok, and then you get into Act 3, we actually know more. And that is a cool thing to do in the middle of a show, instead of just waiting till the end to reveal everything.
And seeing how everyone catches up with what we know. There's some great writing for Tuvok in some of these scenes in Act 3. So there's logical Tuvok when he says, "It is, however, a pattern, and a pattern implies purpose. We simply have to uncover it."
Yeah.
It's so very Tuvok. But then a couple lines later, he says, and this is sarcastic Tuvok, arguably the best Tuvok, we'll see.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should conduct a seance about Janeway referencing a ghost assailant.
Yes, I loved that line. And by the way, I think sarcastic Tuvok is probably neck and neck with machine gun Tuvok.
I have another candidate to consider, another version of Tuvok.
Okay.
We saw a space lighter with space lighter sound effects.
Yes.
Right? Perfect for lighting your space candles or space incense to cover the clouds of smoke from your space bomb.
Yeah, of course. And he had that in his room, and then he gets to go over to the vanity, and we have the return of the space sink. So I was really glad to see the return of the space sync old friend in Star Trek. And I love the whole idea that Tuvok, once he realized this was going on, he goes into the holodeck and then he asks the computer for some information, and the computer says, no, that's restricted. And he goes like, okay, override the restriction. Like, okay, like you don't even need to have that line because that's all he does. Like, no, I'm Tuvok. I asked in the first place. Just give me the
Face
info I
ID.
need.
Face ID not accepted. Just look at my face. Face ID accepted.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
So when he comes on the scene and revealing like what happened, so here's my new candidate for consideration for best Tuvok. Is turtleneck Tuvok the best Tuvok? Right?
Ooh.
He looks, Tim looks so good in just kind of like the lavender turtleneck with just the pins of the communicator on. That's like an interesting kind of non-formal, kind of like off-duty uniform, right? It's like just the shirt and the collars, pips, and communicator pin. It screams, I just got out of bed, and I love it. I'm here for it.
Yeah. No, he's really cool. There should have been an action figure.
That's what I think. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. No, I love that at the end of that scene, Tuvok asks the computer how tall the image in the holodeck would be. How tall the person is who is imaged by the holodeck, and the computer just says 182 centimeters. Could have done that a long time ago, because he asked Harry, and he goes like, how tall do you think that is? And Harry's like, I don't know, between 170 and 190 centimeters. Why? Just ask the computer. It's right there.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe they should have had the seance. Right?
Maybe.
I love the close-up of the medical tricorder when the doctor was scanning Tuvok, because that was really close-up. Even on standard definition, we're still dealing with DVD quality here. It was a perfect hero prop. And it had all the blinking lights. It had enough light to be able to kind of like show a secondary light source on Kim's face. How much do you think that would have cost the production department to make one of those?
Not cheap, man. Those to get handcrafted like that for the shows, those are in the thousands.
You didn't see any scenes, you didn't see any flash molding, anything.
That looked really good. Interesting that we have kind of an attack here through mind meld. That's the premise of how this plays out. I do want to come back to this because I think it's an interesting thing that we get to explore in Star Trek. And man, I love Tim's performance. Like from here on out, he gets to play so many layers, so many levels, and he's just great. He is such an MVP who doesn't get the attention that he deserved in this series. But thank goodness we get a little more out of him here. Interesting here, this idea. Yeah, Tuvok reviewed every letter in the most recent data stream except his own.
Right.
Okay. So apparently he just read everybody else's mail. But yeah, I can't be bothered with my own thing.
I like that we see Tuvok's son. 7 isolates the frequency and it changes to Tiro. It's really interesting. You see on the right-hand side of the astrometric screen, you see Tiro's face in the center. And then to the right, you're seeing like this weird kind of script that was, it wasn't there before. I don't know if that's Bajoran. I don't know Bajoran well enough to see it on site. But I thought that was a neat idea. I thought it was a neat touch.
Yeah. All the little details, really nice there. Okay, just a little word here about the language that they're using. So they keep referring to things as a letter. And in this case, a letter is actually an audio-video message. Which, by the way, when Sek says there's not enough room for music, well, come on. Music is just going to be data. It's the same kind of data, so whatever. But seriously, though, you could send a whole lot more with just text. So maybe if it comes down to it, they could be sending text messages back and forth to the Alpha Quadrant. That would have helped. But I did find it interesting that in the 24th century, at least in this version of it that we see here projected from the 20th century, they keep the word letter, meaning just a message from somebody home. So maybe we won't lose that.
Something that I know that irks you, with the conceit of having letters on pads, but only like one letter per pad, like back in, well, I wouldn't say back in the day, but like in the future.
Yeah.
I also, I find it interesting that we believe in the conceit that a phaser won't kill you until it's announced that it will. when
Yes.
characters, especially
Yeah.
main characters, are shot. Because
Yeah.
Chakotay could have killed Tom if he wanted to under, Heroes programming, but no, he's just stunned.
Yeah.
I know that it was an issue with some people. There was a stun and kill setting on the phasers in Star Trek 2009 where they kind of flipped, like the barrel flipped horizontally.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I think it works because at least people know that those characters weren't killed, since the beams are the exact same color.
Well, that is kind of a weird thing here, is that every phase, there's a lot of phaser fire as we end of Act 4, beginning of Act 5. Everything's on stun. You just have to go with it that everything is on stun. And then, interesting to me that Chakotay refers to Janeway as Catherine, because I thought, well, okay, this is when they're actually, a bit closer to each other. And I wondered, is Maquis Chakotay, is he that comfortable to call her Catherine? So it seemed a little out of character for that guy, unless he just somehow knew that would get under her skin, which I guess is acceptable as well, but seemed, it seemed a little odd.
Technically, she's not captain anymore, so he doesn't have to refer to her in the formal.
That's true. He is the captain. I'm the captain now.
So I'm calling the shots.
Right. Yeah.
I see what you did there.
You see what I did there? Yeah. Vulcan brandy. Why have we not had some?
I'm surprised it wasn't Saurian, but that's just me. I'm an old schooler.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. Fair enough. When Chakotay gets the report, he hears that there are 23 crew members yet who aren't yet Maquis, who haven't yet had the sort of the mind control switch turned on. And I thought, wait a minute, there's only about 140 plus crew members in total on Voyager. So we're talking like maybe less than a third, right around there, are Maquis. I mean, that's a significant number of people. I didn't realize we'd picked up that many. I always thought it was about 8 to 10, something like that.
The Valjean was bigger than I thought. Right?
Yeah, big ship, yeah. Now, speaking of phasers, and of course the announcement that the phaser is set to kill, is this the first discharged phaser that we've seen in Star Trek? Because it was kind of a funny effect. You just see the little spark on the nozzle there.
We did see one in a way when Chekhov tried to fire his weapon escaping the prison in San Francisco.
That's
right. Must be radiation.
Star Trek 4.
It just fizzles out. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Shoot me with a ray gun.
Yeah.
Right.
Good point. Yeah.
But again, for storytelling purposes, do we really believe in the conceit that that's going to happen? Like that Janeway is going to be killed and removed from the show? So I thought it would have been cooler if they bring in an unknown crewman, or maybe one of the Maquis, or like someone that one of Tuvok's security guards that he trained and said, take him out. Because you don't know if an extra is going to get, removed from the show or not.
We'll get right back to Repression after a word from this week's sponsor, Bezigo.
All right. We need to talk about one of summer's most persistent enemies. No, not the Borg, but mosquitoes.
Ooh, yeah, I know. Look, growing up in Alabama, I knew that a buzz in your ear at night meant one thing, an itchy morning. That, my friend, is the tyranny of mosquitoes.
And now that I live at Wolf 359, Florida, I'm basically on the front lines of the mosquito war. But we may finally have the tech to fight back.
Enter this week's sponsor, Bezigo Iris, the world's first AI-powered mosquito detector.
Bezigo uses smart computer vision to detect, track, and pinpoint mosquitoes in real time. No more waving in the dark or guessing where that buzz is coming from. I hate that buzz.
Now, once a mosquito lands, it uses an eye-safe laser to show you exactly where it is. And it works even in total darkness thanks to night vision detection.
You also get real-time alerts through the app, so you can act fast even if you're not in the room. And best of all, it's completely chemical-free. No sprays, and no toxic plugins.
It's perfect for bedrooms, great for travel, and honestly, just a smart way to take back your space.
So, John, and so the rest of the audience, are you ready to reclaim your nights?
Yes, I am. Here's what to do. Stop losing sleep over mosquitoes. Take back your nights with Bizigo. Go to bizigo.com/discount/buzz10 and save 10% off.
That's bzigo.com/discount/buzz10. That's BUZZ10, and use the code BUZZ10 to get 10% off.
Say goodbye to itchy bites and sleepless nights, and thank you, Bizigo, for sponsoring this episode.
We haven't seen Chell in years. He must be fitting in with the crew better. Nobody told him to drop and give them 50.
There's an interesting idea here that I feel like Star Trek hasn't always explored. Like every now and then they'll kind of walk right up to the line with it and then kind of step back before we spend too much time there. But the idea of this attack and manipulation through mind meld, and it's almost like Vulcans are particularly good candidates for this. You know, if you're going to use somebody as a weapon or use their abilities for an aggressive purpose. It's interesting in the respect that Vulcans already, they kind of have this burden by having the power of a mind meld. Like imagine just people growing up just living on Vulcan and knowing that they can do this to each other in the first place, and the gross power imbalance that would portend. You know, whether it's a parent to a child or a teacher to a student or a manager, a boss to a worker, whatever like that, that's a dangerous thing to walk around with anyway. And no wonder the Vulcans have built up such a strict code of ethics and this foundation of logic, because the ones who would survive having this power are the ones who would have to be disciplined, right? You know, if this is completely run amok anyway, then those are the ones who would not survive. But we have seen the mind meld used as a violation before. And I point you to Spock forcibly extracting information from Valeris in The Undiscovered Country.
Right.
Really powerful dramatic scene. I think you can deem it as necessary given the stakes, although that is a debatable point, and I would love to hear people's comments and thoughts about that. We haven't discussed that in a long, long time. Mm-hmm. But I thought about it here, like, wow, here is this open door ability for somebody else to exploit that power to then exploit others. And it's a really interesting thing. And I would imagine that as a Vulcan, and particularly somebody with a code of ethics, like Tuvok in particular, that would be a tough thing to walk around with.
Mind melds are really, really tricky. Kind of like the Vulcan mysticism and the mythology behind, you know, what their psychic powers are or aren't. Mm-hmm. They're pretty much driven by an as-needed, you know, on-call basis. How it affects the story or how it gets them out of the story from being painted into a corner. I think that's something that's a little bit more prevalent now than it was before. Like before, one of the things in the original series that really struck me as being interesting is Mirror, Mirror, when Mirror Spock says to, I believe it's Sulu, he said, "Many of my associates are Vulcan." And when he says that, it terrifies
it
Sulu.
Strikes fear into Sulu, absolutely.
Right? And that's something about, again, the Vulcan mysticism, the alienness of Spock. Even that Spock is half Vulcan, half human, there's still that. And
yeah.
I remember when they first used the mind meld in the original series, and he said that it's a very private, very personal connection when they do this. And now the mind meld in kind of like the vernacular of Star Trek as a total fandom, again, it's kind of like the sonic screwdriver. It was used very specifically for very specific purposes in order to move the narrative along. But now it pretty much opens everything, anytime, anywhere, because it's so heavily leaned on and it's almost expected. So here are a couple questions that I have about the Vulcan mystical arts, if you will. Do all Vulcans possess this ability? Or are they only trained to use this ability? If so, then who is given the responsibility to train them? Priests, priestesses, people high in the government, the Vulcan Science Academy? Because there is that. Also, is this something that they teach certain Vulcans on their way to achieving Ponfar? I mean, not Ponfar.
Kolinar.
Kolinar.
Not to be confused.
Right. Or do they? Is Ponfar part of the ritual? Is this part of the Ponfar ritual in order to fully explore all of kind of like the Vulcan passions?
Man, so you're asking good questions that really do apply to like the whole Star Trek mythos, you know? This is a powerful thing to have. And I think if you're treating it as a real world thing, there is a certain element of danger there. And there's, like you mentioned in Mirror Mirror, there's a certain fear that others would have of species that have this ability, because it can easily be exploited. All you need is one bad Vulcan who can wreak all kinds of havoc by having this ability. More
to the point, there is a scene in Star Trek V, and it's such an interesting scene. It's when Sybok takes off his hood and reveals, to his very first apostle who he is, that he's a Vulcan. But that character looks at Sybok with such reverence, and he goes, "You're a Vulcan." They're unicorns.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like a full Vulcan, like Sybok, is something unheard of in the wild.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you're not behind the tenets and the codes of ethics of Starfleet.
Well, see, that's where it gets interesting if we step out of the Star Trek mythos and just step into the reality of writing for production. Okay, what are the guardrails you're going to put on these characters who have this ability? How out there are they? How integrated into the rest of the galaxy are they? Are they that rare, like a unicorn? Do they kind of stick to themselves because they have this thing that can be dangerous to themselves and to others? And I love what you're posing as well. Do they have the ability to control this? Like, do some have better or worse telepathic powers than others? Is it something that needs to be trained? Can some people lose that ability? What are the rules set on it? And I don't want to jump too far ahead here, but we will get to a point in Star Trek that is being made in the 21st century where some of those rules get bent almost beyond recognition.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really tough thing. I think that is a really problematic thing for the people who write those abilities into those characters, because then you have to ask again, okay, wait, could we do this all along? Are we, Right.
And, in the lore building, you're always going to, suffer some type of escalation, right? Because characters change, motivations change, the plots, you just have so much more. They're just demanded to have certain things, become a little bit more ubiquitous because that's what the fandom wants. It's like our issue with Unimatrix Zero and the whole bridging of minds, mind meld technique that all of a sudden Tuvok can do because he said he saw an elder perform it. He didn't perform it himself until that moment. So what does that mean? Do you have the talent inherently? Right? And if so, what is somebody like, the Bajoran Vedic who was able to reprogram Tuvok? Like, I mean, that's something dangerous. That's something that it could have been done to a variety of Vulcans, not just Tuvok.
Yeah, for real. And that brings us to specifically what's happening here with Tuvok. And I don't really have much of a comment on it other than I'm intrigued by the idea of this being a little nod to the Manchurian Candidate. And it's a setup that it certainly comes back to Star Trek every now and then, and certainly comes back to other popular culture every now and then. Like you have this pretense of the mind control and somebody is acting out of character, and okay, here's what happened. So the story goes from here. And they do actually call Tiro a fanatic at a certain point. So there is some gauging of, well, his behavior and what he wants out of this Maquis faction is different from what rank and file Bajorans want. And I think that's all fine. I don't think there's much of a point to be made about it other than that, yeah, Star Trek does this every now and then. Mind control is a technique to recruit agents, is a thing that shows up in popular culture every now and then, partly because I think it's some of our fantasy version of what that is. And I won't dig too much into, MK Ultra or ideas like that where contemporary governments, contemporary spy agencies have tried to see if that is a thing that can be exploited. And yes, people can be brainwashed, but the popular fiction version of that is like, oh, no, we just have these techniques and we can get fully into somebody's brain to change their personality and turn that on and off like a light switch to make them do exactly what we want. Little different reality than it is from the fiction version here.
Or we see that in a variety of different fandoms too. Homeland, probably one of the more recent ones, which was done really, really well in terms of sleeper agents, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I mean, anything. If you have a fandom, linked to it, you have a sleeper agent story that you're going to right into it because it's just one of those things we like. I wanted to pivot to something that I really enjoyed in this episode, and that was kind of like a return to the Maquis and the Maquis arc. And we said earlier in the very beginning, we've lost the overall focus on the Maquis. They've been there with the crew for 6.5 years.
Yeah.
And I think that there's so many lost opportunities, I think, that we've talked about when it comes to the Maquis, certain characters that were utilized or underutilized, or with the exception of Seska and then maybe Suter, never really had a chance to kind of be seen again, with the exception of Chell, who came back in this episode. But there are these two scenes that I thought were really interesting. The first was earlier on, when Chakotay tells Janeway, maybe someone on your crew couldn't put the past behind them. And Janeway says, my crew. And then Chakotay kind of says, our crew.
Our crew.
Right?
Yeah.
And then, when Tuvok activates Chakotay, Janeway says to him, what's Tiro done to you? And Chakotay says, he simply helped us remember who we are. We're Maquis. We've always been Maquis. So I'm wondering, has that subtext been there all along when we're watching Chakotay and his friction with Janeway at times, or with B'Elanna, with the crew at times, or any character that we know being Maquis now, the static that they have with the crew at times, especially like in the episode with the lower deck characters. I think one of them was a Maquis, and he was very irritable, didn't click with the crew. So I'm just wondering if their true feelings sometimes that bubble to the surface, because I think that's that's something that may have affected the way that the crew interacts with Janeway. Here's the big issue that I have with kind of like the inconsistent storytelling of the Maquis, and I don't know if you feel this way. Maybe somewhere deep down in their subconscious, the Maquis never really felt like they were equals to the Starfleet crew. I think that there's a certain level of elitism, a passive-aggressive elitism that the Starfleet crew has when dealing with the Maquis. It just feels like you're wearing those pins, then you're lesser than. And there's a certain level of classism that's being developed between those two elements, Starfleet and everyone else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's such a shame that it never got explored, because I like this idea that there might have been some either resentment or uneasiness among the crew because they're identified that way. And, there's a way to kind of examine the Maquis experience because, all right, some of them are Starfleet at various levels of Starfleet, and some of them are Bajorans, some of them come from different walks of life. But Maquis is something that they did. it's not something that they are necessarily, unless some of them are so tied to their identity being a Maquis, like Tiro. I mean, here's somebody who they say is a fanatic, and that is his identity, and that his sole purpose is being a Maquis and striking terror into others. But there's a way to dismantle the things that would have caused a rift between Voyager's Starfleet crew and those people who were formerly Maquis that I think would have made more sense if they had played out over time in this show. Look, at the same time, I guess it's just sort of the prerogative of this particular episode. They say, oh, no, it's mind control. Therefore, we can do whatever we want with these characters and make them act out of step with how we know them. And Tuvok is the prime example, because as far as we know, Tuvok was entirely undercover that whole time. There's no reason to suspect that his loyalties ever changed at any point. He was just a very good Starfleet officer doing his job undercover. So any resentment, any disconnect between him and his Starfleet duties, honestly, shouldn't exist anyway.
It's a good thing Tom's holodeck theater was just doing 3D movies. You could have gotten a completely different episode with the holodeck William Castle and the Hollow Tingler.
All right, we have done our best to, unrepress the repression here and dig in, see what we could learn, either in the way of morals, meanings, messages, and whether or not the episode holds up. And that's what we do at the end of every episode. So, Norman, I'm going to kick it over to you first. Repression, meaning the episode, not the concept. I think the concept of repression definitely holds up. But does the episode Repression hold up for you?
Maybe there was an awakening of sorts, when I watched this episode, because I think that I actually grew to enjoy this episode the more I watched it, but for very specific reasons. I didn't dislike the episode, and I rarely I probably never say I hated an episode. I know that I've been disappointed by episodes.
Sure.
Especially recently in the past. So I found the episode entertaining. Mm-hmm. I like whodunit stories, and maybe that's where some of Brandon's rewrites kind of gave us a little bit of this, almost kind of like a Sherlock Holmes / trying to find Jack the Ripper kind of story. Like you can't find the criminal because the criminal is you. I love the conceit that Tuvok was the sleeper agent, but not just the sleeper agent. He was kind of like the Typhoid Mary or the Typhoid Tuvok. You can use that.
Typhoid Tuvok.
You can use that if you want, if you will. That is the one who you activate him, and he's like the Trojan horse. Get him inside, and then he opens up the gates for everybody else. So I thought that was an interesting concept, and I like that it takes us all the way back to Tuvok's time infiltrating the Maquis, which also brings us in reference to Chakotay, B'Elanna, the Valjean, going into the Badlands, and the events in Caretaker. So I'm a sucker for soft origin stories. When you finally get to a point in the series where they can tell you a little bit more background information on these characters. So we're getting a little bit of that in this episode because obviously something really traumatic happened to Tuvok, and maybe that in turn affected his relationships with Janeway or anyone else on the ship, because now subconsciously he's just so much more guarded. Because of what happened to him under Tiro's programming and torture. So I love that they explored that. But the thing is, the more I watched it, I just felt that there was just a huge disconnect with what they were trying to say in the episode. Like, what was the point of bringing this up now? I really do think that this would have made an excellent two-parter, maybe at the end of, say, season 3, and I don't know how they would fit it in with obviously Seven's storyline, but that's a completely different discussion point altogether. I just think that the further that they drifted away from the Maquis storyline, the less impact these Maquis storylines actually have. because you had some great momentum again with Seska, when she allied herself with Mashkala and they, stranded all the crew and marooned them on a planet. That was great. That was all great. And the Maquis was really well done there. I like that every once in a while, Chakotay is challenged and I think his kind of like his Maquis subconscious kind of kicks in and gets a little bit more defensive or a little bit more abrasive, like towards Janeway, and the way that she just kind of usurps a lot of the decision-making process that maybe the crew should have as a collective group. But as much as I have an issue with some of the minor problems, or maybe major problems in the narrative of the story, the one thing that just holds this entire episode together is Tim Russ. Watching Tim Russ on camera is a privilege, right?
Yeah.
Because when you have an actor given the opportunity to actually flex his ability to act, you get Meld, or you get other episodes that show off and showcase a character. This does. It's just not written as well as some of the other Tuvok-focused episodes. Riddles, another one that we just recently saw.
Yeah.
So watching him really understand and embrace Tuvok, even though that he's been inconsistent in terms of his focused episode from season to season, I still think that Tim understands the character. Tuvok is given such great 360-degree depth and texture and nuance. And I think that if there's something that we can agree on, and many probably do out there, is that he was just not utilized enough in this series. And I know that they put a lot of focus on Seven and her development and the Doctor and Janeway basically escalating between seasons 4 and now. But when Tuvok actually has a chance to shine, there's a reason why we kind of meme Tuvok, on Mission Log. You have Finger Tuvok, you have Machine Gun Tuvok, you have Turtleneck Tuvok. It's because everything he does is awesome. He just doesn't have the opportunity, or is given the opportunity, to be awesome enough and consistently. And that's my biggest problem with returning to Tuvok, in this episode. I want more, and I'm not given enough.
Hard agree. And in fact, this was an episode that I was really ready to just write off, because I thought we were, in the beginning, I thought we were going too many just conventional, obvious ways. And to me, okay, well, the whodunit is just the whodunit. And after you reveal that, there's not much replay value. But I think the biggest problem with this episode is what you just said, and that's that it didn't come out during season 3. Because this should have come out during season 3. It should have come out at a point where the Maquis sort of disconnect was still there. Well, when we could still acknowledge, like, wait a minute, there might be crew members who aren't fully on board with this, who aren't getting along, and let this thread play out a little bit. And let's actually get into what Tuvok's role was there and what happened to him while he was undercover. And did that open up a bigger rift with Chakotay and B'Elanna and others on the team? There are all these interesting angles to go, but we saved it for one episode in the final season when everybody on board had already forgotten about all of this. Now, as far as an episode goes, they do the classic thing, which is you introduce characters who seem suspicious. You throw us off from the real culprit. So, you do that to the audience. And then that way you could even kill off, although they don't do that here, but you could actually cause some harm to your characters because it's not the main crew. So we kind of walk right up to that line and then don't really do that. And as a whodunit episode, it's pretty good. I like the Manchurian candidate-ness of it all. I think using Tuvok as that character, as the conduit, inspired choice, for sure. And like you, we just don't get enough Tim Russ. We don't get enough Tuvok in this series as a whole. But when we do get him front and center in an episode, man, he really delivers. So I like that this episode comes along and at least acknowledges that we did have the Maquis, but it just feels like too little too late. And having this story about Tuvok and his special circumstance, rather than taking the time to address the whole issue of the Maquis being on board, that is unfortunately a wasted opportunity. Look, it's not just Voyager. There are a lot of shows that have missed opportunities. I think this episode is fine. It's not that it doesn't hold up, but to use one of your standards against it, it's that you could sort of remove this and it wouldn't really matter. And that's because we haven't integrated the Tuvok story enough, and specifically we haven't integrated the Maquis story enough to really make it count. Now it just feels like a footnote, and we're going to get back to something else next week, I assume. So it has all the hallmarks. It ticks all the right boxes, but it's just a little too light of a tick on that box and maybe a little too late.
I think what we are struggling with a little bit here, and maybe in some more recent episodes, because I think that this is more of a consistent and general failing of the series, probably in seasons 6 and now 7, is it any different than any other science fiction show out there? That's the real big sticking point. I love Star Trek. I love Star Trek because it has a very specific goal in mind, when it comes to its storytelling and the way that it frames social allegory through its storytelling. But if we're not capitalizing on that in the fandom, then how is it different than any other science fiction show that does this type of storytelling better?
Yeah.
And you don't want that to be taken away from Star Trek. You want Star Trek to be,
course.
If you are a true and, loyal, and passionate fan for Star Trek, you want your stories to be at the top of your fandom pantheon, not as an average fandom in the science fiction genre.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, and then that leads us to what is most important to us on Mission Log, and that's determining if there is a moral meaning or a message. And this might be one of those where there isn't really, at least not in the way that we look for them here, like a classic, save the whales, don't be racist, war is bad type of message, which is all true, by the way. But it's okay for Star Trek to also do these kind of experiments with the characters where you just say, well, we're going to tell a fun whodunit story, or we're going to do this, we're going to do the romance, or we're going to do the soap opera type story. That's okay. Star Trek is big enough to absorb all of that. But I do think that Tuvok has an interesting journey here. Again, wish we had gotten more, wish there was a lot more Tuvok spread out throughout the whole series. But just in this episode, it is interesting that they focus on him going from his own curiosity about his hunch to being determined to find evidence to fit his hypothesis that there is a perpetrator, which... That's a bad idea, folks, when you look for evidence to fit the thing that you already think, even though he hasn't pointed any fingers at anybody in particular yet, but he's a little aggressive about his investigation at first because he's really ready to pin this on somebody. But then ultimately, he does follow the evidence wherever it goes, even if it points to him. And that actually makes him a good investigator, even if his initial behavior was questionable. He was being led by his own, his hunch, his intuition, and his desired outcome over just logically following evidence. Now, in the end, we rely on a trope, which is common to stories like this, and it's common to Star Trek. Okay, so think about this moment. Tuvok is ultimately swayed by his friendship with Janeway. Now, that's a great thing. Is it realistic given the in-universe, in-episode circumstances here? Well, maybe not. But I think they felt like they had to put a bit of an emotional button on this. And don't get me wrong, I wouldn't trade that last scene in the theater with the 3D glasses. Wouldn't trade that for anything. but you do have to wrap it up kind of neatly. And it's just, nope, at the end of the day, it's their friendship. It's Janeway getting through to Tuvok that saves the day. Although he does have the out and say, look, logically, he wouldn't have handed me a phaser set to kill, but that's okay. They can both have their reality when it comes to that. So it's cute. It drives home the idea of friendship being more powerful, the Force, than anything else. Are we breaking any new ground here? No. But that's all right. How about you, Norman?
Well, I mean, I'm in the same boat as you. I mean, I didn't really land on a traditional moral or meaning or message, but I wanted to take the time to maybe continue to expound upon, some of the ideas that if the episode held up, and maybe how this episode, or maybe even Voyager as a series in total, would have landed or may land more successfully for me. Right, so Voyager had the opportunity, this really unique chance to explore what it meant to be either one, how to serve Starfleet and its goals, and two, delve more deeply into why certain Starfleet officers decided to forego their commissions because they believed in what the Maquis was doing at the time. So I think what we really need to see to make an episode like this really work is kind of like how these relationships between crew members, or lack thereof, right? How these personalities, they put aside kind of like these fundamental beliefs, Starfleet versus Maquis, in order to all row in the same direction, survive the Delta Quadrant, and get home. Because that's what we're really like working with here. We're working with two very specific, fundamental, passionate, and opposing goals. But if you're on the same ship and there's only one way back, you're not going to row in different directions. You're going to row in the same direction, right?
Sure.
And hopefully have each other's backs. So there could have been something really interesting there. There also could have been really an interesting study in kind of like the class dynamics on the ship between the Maquis and Starfleet. I've always believed that in some sense or another, Starfleet, even in other Star Trek series, that when you're walking around in a Starfleet uniform, you almost have an air of acting better than. There's a certain elitism to it. And of course, for good reason, because, they went to this academy. They were very smart, very driven, very talented, very educated. You just don't get, put in charge of several hundred tons of starship just because you showed up, unless you're Kirk, right? Yeah. Or I should say 2009's Kirk.
Right.
But I always believed that it's kind of like Harry. When Harry walked onto Deep Space Nine, walked into Quark's bar, it's not that he was naive. He just wasn't worldly. The reason why he wasn't worldly is because he was insulated by his life, growing up with means, going to Starfleet, and then just basically having his life put on a very specific track. Does that add towards a certain elitism? I think so. Doesn't necessarily make him wrong or make him bad. It just makes him this way, right? But then you have the Maquis, right? They believe fighting for independence, for freedom, for rights, for being treated as equals, for being treated with respect, for basically land, water, freedom, right? But why should those be any lesser than Starfleet's goals? They're working towards the same goals. They're just working in different ways. Right. So you have what's called kind of like the silver spooners versus the blue collars, right? And I think that could have been written really well and interesting, especially where Janeway and Chakotay were concerned, because they're technically the captains of their very specific teams. Janeway for Starfleet, Chakotay for the Maquis. And that's where some of this could have been resolved before they got to Seven and focused on her storyline. If Janeway really meant our crew to Chakotay, then shouldn't all of them be wearing the same everything? I mean, yes, they wear the same uniforms, but why do you wear the Maquis rank pins? You might as well either not wear any pins at all, or be commissioned to wear Starfleet pins if you're an officer. Because aside from that, you're basically wearing a giant scarlet letter on your chest. Right? Or, for lack of a better term, a symbol, a derogatory symbol that is sewn on your jacket. Because that is basically what everyone's telling them when you encounter someone wearing a Maquis pin. You are not Starfleet, you are lesser than.
Yeah.
And I think I thought it was unfortunate. I wish that, and maybe in the rest of season 7, we might see this, but Star Trek to me has always been tied to this through line, this moral meaning and message that's inside, the storytelling, that from top to bottom, from high class to low class, from silver spooners to blue collars, if you're all on the same ship, if you're all in the same situations together, you find compromises, you find sacrifices, you find the ability to work together and achieve the same goal. In this case, in Star Trek's, in their allegories, a better human race. And I think the elements were there and maybe still are there in Voyager. I'm sadly seeing a lot of these fantastic nuggets and DNA of storytelling fall so short of their potential, because they can be great. They were so close, and they just don't quite get there.
Mission Log is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you'd like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com, and for more Star Trek news and discussion, visit trekmovie.com.
On the next Mission Log, Critical Care.
Some of the music for Mission Log provided by Warp 11, online at warp11.com. Special thanks to consulting producers, Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Chris Garris, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Shabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takachi. What happened in this episode was very disturbing, but for real trauma, Tom has to show Manos, the hands of fate in the theater. End transmission.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.